Yes. Hello, welcome everybody. Watkonuaradu Sawagwegu Gadzitsagatsayujuts. My English name is Lindsay Delaronde. I am the Indigenous Resurgence Coordinator for the Fine Arts Department. During this time of COVID-19, where everything has been moved online, I have the privilege and honor to engage with Indigenous artists, educators, knowledge keepers, and this next episode is part of the Blue Heron series. And the next person that I'm interviewing and having a conversation with is the amazing Siku Allooloo. I'm going to just read a brief bio from Siku. Just give me one sec here. Gosh, no, I can't find it. Okay, 1 second here. Let's see. 1 second.
I can also just introduce myself.
Yeah, let's just do that then.
Bios are kind of cheesy anyway.
Okay. You know, I did that for my uncles and it was really long and it just was like, so yeah, I'll just allow you to introduce yourself. I think that's good. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I'm Inuk and Haitian Taino. My mother was from Haiti, originally known as Quisqueya, and on her side we're a mix of Haitian, Taino, Spanish, French, African people that liberated themselves and first ones to overthrow a colonial empire. And my dad's side, we're from Mi'kmaq, from North Baffin Island in Nunavut. And I'm also part of a Denendeh family from the Northwest Territories. So that's where I'm rooted and where I call home. I am currently based in Whitehorse, although technically I'm not there today. And I do a mix of things. I'm a writer, I write poetry, creative nonfiction, like rants, and all different kinds of things in the writing world. I also do land-based education. Mostly it's been with Denendeh communities, with elders and knowledge holders and students in different Denendeh territories for about 3 or 4 weeks at a time. And a lot of that work is centered around Indigenous governance and creating a community that runs off of cultural governance models. And what else do I do? Right now I'm currently working with the Yukon government, with the Women's Directorate, in developing a strategy on missing murdered Indigenous women.
Thank you for your introduction. It's really kind of a full circle for you and I. We were both at UVic during the time you were doing your degree in anthropology, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was quite almost 10 years ago.
Yeah. I probably met you like maybe 12 or even 14 years ago. Yeah, I remember your mural work, or your huge screen of the wolf.
Yeah, the wolf prints.
Yeah.
So you know, just in terms of, I think, a little bit of history of how you've come to reflect on your experience at the University of Victoria, being in anthropology, and some of the interest and focus of the work that you were doing there. You want to talk a little bit about sort of the origins of that?
Yeah. I originally came to UVic from the Northwest Territories because we don't have a university. Actually, any of the 3 territories in the north, they have colleges, which are mostly vocational kind of departments. And if you want to do actual proper university education, you have to leave. And at the time, most people from back home were going to Alberta, and I wanted to come to the ocean. So that's what drew me out to Victoria. I found my way into anthropology and also Indigenous studies, and was really lucky. I feel like looking back, I've really come to understand how informative all of the different departments regarding Indigenous issues at UVic have really helped shape activism and intellectualism, and a lot of the decolonization programming that is happening across the country, socially, structurally. I think a lot of that is because of the work done at UVic through the Indigenous Governance Department, the law school, the political science department, and Indigenous studies, and also the anthro department. I worked really closely with Michael Ash and Mark Pinkowski, and their anthro professors. They were amazing for me because they helped guide my learning about colonialism and just the way that colonialism has happened and remains part of the dynamic between Indigenous peoples and the state. So I got to spend a couple of years really diving into what that means, because so much wasn't part of the dialogue at the time. The TRC, I think, hadn't quite started yet. And they also they were supportive of me self-directing a lot of my own learning, which is actually why I was able to complete university. I was interested in learning, after I got a handle on colonialism, I wanted to learn about Indigenous movements, especially led by some of my family members back home in the NWT, and also Nunavut. So they really helped me, supported me to do directed learning, and also to be part of land-based education, Decolonial Center for Research and Learning, which had just started in 2010. So yeah, UVic has been amazing and very, very formative on all fronts.
Thank you for taking the time to just reflect in sort of like a past reflection of your education, because it also, I think, what we forget in the academy is work that has already been accomplished and those alliances that have already been cultivated. I think, for a position like mine, the Indigenous Resurgence Coordinator, it's a very new position for that department. The ordained position, which is held for Pacific Northwest Coast artists, is very new as well. And so the fine arts is really, I think, trying to find that platform and to, I think, utilize the resources that all those departments that you mentioned have worked so hard at looking at education through a decolonizing lens. Really kind of taking a step back and looking at, how do we educate Indigenous students? How do we retain Indigenous students? And how do we create content and courses that really reflect a desettlerization, removing that sort of colonial rule, that dominant narrative? How do we challenge that in a good way? And so it's really, I think, crucial for faculty to be able to hear that from a student perspective, that there has been people on your journey that has really cultivated that for you and helped you, like you said, really understand colonialism. Now, with understanding colonialism in an education setting, that's one aspect. And I think there's been other layers that I've read in some of your reading. You're addressing and bringing up some of the emotional impacts of colonization on women's bodies, violence against women. How would you say that you've really started to understand colonialism in a more kind of personal reflection outside of the institution? Who has helped you shape that understanding?
That's such a good question. I think for me, the first time I really remember having a connection between my bodied understanding and my intellectual understanding when I was a student in UVic was realizing that we're talking about colonialism in broad themes, in kind of like systemic understanding of past policies and things that have been carried out. But I have two dads, and they were both residential school survivors. And when it kind of crystallized for me that everything that we were talking about in these like broad scopes were really depersonalized for the most part. And when I thought about, okay, this kind of informs why there's so much fractionalization in my own family, so much different kinds of disconnection, and like all the kind of social systemic issues that Indigenous communities get framed with, like addiction and poverty and endemic violence and intergenerational effects of residential school, that became all part of the dialogue while I was a student. And those are all things that are in my family and in my lived experience. And I started realizing that nobody outside of one of my own family members or somebody from my own community or culture knows this stuff better than we do. So I started kind of flipping the way that I appreciate knowledge. And at one point I wanted to leave university because I thought nobody from my family has really gone through university, has like attained a full degree, and all the knowledge that is going to help me learn the most about what it means to be a human being in this world, and to have all the values and the connection to land and to who we are, and all that knowledge that is so vital, that will not come from the academy, that has to come from being connected. So I wanted to leave because I was sick of learning just about colonialism and not really being nourished. And luckily, I was able to be part of the first ever land-based education program back home, and UVic let me do that. And so I was able to have that kind of influence in the rest of my studies, and just connecting with more. I think the Indigenous student body in general was becoming like more connected and more radicalized. I don't know, more was happening. We were just building connections all across the board socially. And so that kind of like helped us bolster one another and see each other and understand more and more and more, like how real this is, how much power we have, how substantial every one of our cultural knowledges are. It was really, really supportive to be a student there.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I remember that movement for sure. The time of Idle No More, the time of the renaming of Pacols. There was a lot of movement. Even the first Stolen Sisters Memorial March back in 2009 was created by the Native Students Union at UVic at the time. And it was building that alliance with Camosun students. And now we have that every year during Valentine's Day, to remember our stolen sisters. And so I think what you're really talking about, I think, is the potential that the Academy kind of exists, with a very specific alchemy, with timing, with the type of student body, with the type of thinkers that are coming in from other communities. Nation to nation building, I think, has been really critical at the university as well. And then I think what you're also talking about is sort of the disconnect from the theoretical approach that education dominantly, and the conventional way of learning in the theory of colonialism, and then looking at, wow, like this really has impacted my own family in a very tangible way that I've experienced. And so I think that's an important element that needs to come in when we start looking at decolonizing the academy, there's an accountability there and a
Right.
responsibility to create a safe environment for this work to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if I hadn't connected with Michael Ash and Mark Pinkowski, if I had just connected with other professors at the time in the anthro department, I don't think I would have found my, like, the crack that I ended up, kind of living in within that system, because they provided a lot of space for me to self-determine my own path forward. And I think I'm naturally a very self-determined person, and yeah, they did create the right amount of space. There was also like key people in the women's studies department and the fine arts department that at the time they were giving elective courses that were so profound. And so all of that, I'm not sure what UVic is like these days, but all of that really fit together in creating essential space for myself, and I know for sure for the other people that were alongside me.
Thank you. Thank you. Just want to talk a little bit about bringing that sort of past and the origins. It's really nice when we can stitch all of those influences together to see that it's a compound, that our knowledge just doesn't come from one stream, that there's all aspects of knowledge that we can engage in. And like you said, self-determine our pathway, especially I think as Indigenous people are, rising within the academy. There's more recruitment and people taking that pathway. And then I think hitting the roadblock and hitting the wall of the institution saying, but there's so much that the institution cannot give me too.
Right.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention actually some of the most influential people in my life at the time were also other students of color, and were in women's studies majors and political science majors. And so I would talk to them, like tell them all about colonialism and Indigenous movements, and they would tell me all about like political theories and social movements and decolonization from a lens of people of color and like oppressed people and gender, and like it was really lateral.
I think it's powerful when that affirmation and that alliance has that momentum. And then moving with that momentum and graduating and going into creative spaces with artists and becoming artists and embodying artists. I think with all of those, the land-based teachings, your family influence from both your parents, and I would say that, what's that becoming artist and stepping into more of that creative practice been like for you?
I fought it. I never used to think of myself as an artist before, as a writer before. Writing is something I've done ever since I was a little girl, very young. And something I've come to embrace kind of in a more focused way in recent years, because I can see there's a benefit to being able to communicate things that reach people. So that's different from like communicating as an activist or as an academic. Those kind of things appeal to people that are already interested, I think, in engaging those ways. But to me, when I became more and more aware of how dominant of an issue colonialism is in our everyday lives, and how most of us Indigenous peoples experience gender violence, experience like sexual violence, and just embody all those things, whether we directly experience it or we enact it, or it's broken up our families, or like it's so part of our experience, and it needs to stop. And so a lot of the writing that I do is trying to appeal to people on like a human level. Some of it is intellectual, some of it is emotional, just really trying to get at it so that people have this embodied understanding that these broad issues that are up for discussion, that people are engaging in with decolonization or truth and reconciliation or missing murdered Indigenous women, those things can often get glossed over, but they are real, they are embodied, and most of us experience that.
I think it's so crucial, exactly what you're talking about. I think that layer of accountability when we engage in these topics within the institution and outside of the institution, the seriousness, the continuation that continues to perpetuate. What I love about your writing is it's creative nonfiction. So there's real elements of your life and your life experience. You can vision the land that you're talking about. You can feel the emotion that you write with, and then also provide that space for resiliency and hope. And so that's sort of like the tension in your writing that I feel. You bring this very much this visceral experience as a human. I think you humanize these narratives in really beautiful ways with the way that you write. And then you're also telling these very hard truths, societal commentaries about the way that colonialism has impacted female bodies and gendered violence, and the erasure of our cultures, you know, trying to weave and stitch and remember and go back into these land-based environments where we're remembering and resurgence. So how is that for you strategically when you're writing? Yeah.
I have like tons and tons of storytellers in my family, my parents, all of my parents and my grandparents and cousins. Storytelling's been a huge part of connecting me and my siblings to who we come from and the lands that we come from. My mom was exiled from Haiti from a very young age because there's a genocidal dictator that came into power when she was 10, so they had to flee, and she wasn't able to go back to Haiti for 30 years. So in the course of her life, she ended up in the Northwest Territories raising her kids, and the only way for her to connect us to our culture and our heritage and our homeland was through stories and through passing on her memories. So that was a formative part of my upbringing. And I think that our creation stories have so much power in all of our cultures, and I was always told that those creation stories, it's kind of like they're living, and it's kind of like they happened back in time, at times when the world was different, when different things were possible than they are today, and beings had different kinds of relationships and different kinds of forming the world, and that we can see ourselves within those stories today, and that they kind of work on us over time. And so especially in a lot of my poetry, there's a Inuit creation story that's embedded, probably in really cryptic ways, but there's a Inuk goddess who created all this sea life, and she's known in every Inuit culture throughout the world, and she's just remained with me through all my life. And so she informs a lot of my understanding, and also just my feeling of my relationship to this moment in time and what I have to offer. So she used to be a human woman, and she's part of a very long saga, but eventually she ends up out in the ocean and having her fingers chopped off, and she falls to the bottom of the sea, and every one of her fingers becomes sea life. So she creates all the sea life with all of those severed fingers that then go on to nourish all the Inuit. And she remains at the bottom of the sea, transformed as a half seal, half woman. And she's a goddess, and she kind of like has to free up some of her sea mammals to feed the people, and the people have to maintain a caring, respectful relationship with her. And so that can be taken as like human beings in this time now have to take care of the earth and maintain a special relationship, especially with the ocean, where so much life comes from. And in working with her story in one of my poems, that was one of those visual art piece that I think you were interested in, I came to understand that I'm also somebody who, a woman, an Inuk woman that has ended up very, very far from my traditional territory, in another world, essentially, where Inuit never used to live before. And I, because of colonialism, am severed in various ways. The ways that the Canadian government over the last 150 years and more has worked to separate Indigenous peoples from our homelands and our families and our spirituality and our culture and our practices and our language, every single way. I'm impacted by that. And so those, in a way, are kind of like the severed appendages. And I'm inspired by the way that she never died. She transformed. And I found when I was a student learning about colonialism, I myself was afraid of how much different I am from the people I come from. And I think there's a lot of shame in Indigenous people of this day and age trying to navigate whether it's okay to embrace contemporary culture and to be different, and are we still able to be representatives of who we come from? Do we count? All those things. And I think when I think about all those creation stories, they're all transformation stories, and they're all about bringing new life. And when I think about some of the things that, if I could embrace the tools of today, like writing, which is not something that's traditional in any of my cultures, then I can think about that as one of those sea mammals that can work to nourish the people that I come from and work to protect that connection.
That's a real beautiful reflection. And what I love what you're talking about is the living life force that exists within these creation stories as transformation stories. Even in Iroquois culture, we have Sky Woman. It's female, you know. And I think that when we remember these stories and we carry these stories and we allow them to work through us, we are constantly being transformed.
Totally.
Within keeping them alive. And I think that also brings the responsibility part too, you know. And I think it's a responsibility part on the Academy, you know, when they're wanting to decolonize and have Indigenous knowledge content coming in, like there has to be that responsibility piece of how do we nurture life? How do we nurture and hold these stories as them being living, existing within us, that are transforming us. And so that's something that I keep repeating, I think, over and over is what is institution doing to be responsible and accountable to Indigenous worldviews as these worlds are coming together and transforming each other.
In an actual, like full-on way, not just like a mandate to create a box to tick or something. Like what you're saying is, it makes me think of like how important it is for us as Indigenous women and non-binary peoples, and like all the ones that have experienced the most drastic and extreme forms of violence and discrimination, how powerful we are, and the kinds of knowledge that we embody and the kinds of things that we bring forward. They have the power, and they transform systems entirely. They transform structures that call for that really fundamental change and the creation of something entirely new. So I'm so glad that you are there as the Resurgence coordinator. And I think that that's also, I mean, it speaks to the importance of having work to eradicate violence against Indigenous women and Two-Spirit and trans people. We have an incredible amount of power and things that we need to offer to the world that are so desperately needed today, especially in this time that I hope people are paying attention to, when the earth is forced to stop in the way that society has been running. Yeah, I think that it's a time for human beings to reevaluate the way that we've been operating and the ways that we've objectified the earth, and to really take stock. And I think Indigenous people have so much leadership to offer that is necessary in order to protect life in general.
I agree. And when I was watching that video, you were talking about the McKenzie pipeline.
Yeah.
And how your father was a huge contributor to stopping that pipeline in that territory, in the Yukon territory, was it?
It was in the Northwest Territories,
Northwest
a
Territories.
little bit of Alaska and the Yukon, but most of the Northwest Territories.
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about some of your father's work, because I think sometimes that's when we're in the eye of the storm of it all, it's hard to see if our efforts are not working. But, you know, where is the victory narrative? That's something that I've been trying to look through in terms of looking at activism from the 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s, and looking through that through like documentary and film and photography, and they're all the same image. Canadian military with Indigenous communities, from babies to grandmothers to men and women and all genders. And there's this very this strong dichotomy of other, us and them. Mm-hmm. And I thought, if this is the repeating imagery after decades and decades, in how the media portrays our land defending and our right to protect our waters and our trees and our land, but we're being framed in a way that is in complete opposite of that, then I really was thinking about, well, where's the victory story? How can we show the victories, even if it's, and I was speaking to another person about this, and I asked them, where's the victory story? And they said, well, what about Pacols? You know, what about and they use this example of the people coming together, and fundamentally in this timing was so crucial. So that's my question, if you wanted to just speak a little bit about that, that stopping of the pipeline and your dad's work and the victory in that.
Okay. Well, the McKenzie Valley Pipeline was a huge multinational corporation proposed pipeline in the 1970s. And at the time, it was the largest ever proposed private industrial operation in the entire world. And it was, I think, $16 billion project it was supposed to be. And it was supposed to carry oil from the Arctic Ocean all the way down through the tar sands to Chicago. And at the time, American Indian movement was happening in the States, Red Power in Canada, and all this like huge political momentum and uprising was happening all over the place. And Indigenous communities were super radicalized. And the Denendeh people stood up in opposition to this pipeline because the route that the pipeline was going to cross was going to impact caribou. And caribou are the most essential life source for Denendeh people and Inuit people. And they're very, very sensitive to industrial construction. And so they stood up to defend the caribou, which is also essentially standing up to defend everything that makes Denendeh people who they are and everything that makes Inuit people who we are. And so there was a huge inquiry that happened called the Berger Inquiry, and they met with over 3,000 community members from all across the North, and they all gave testimony to the sacred relationship between our cultures and the land and our responsibilities to remain caretakers and protectors for the future. And then that also led to the development of the Denendeh Nation as a political organization, and kind of also connected to the group that created Nunavut, and kind of all these things came out of that. And what happened was the inquiry ended and they decided to put a moratorium for 10 years on that project, so that people could settle their land claim agreements with the Canadian government. So it was a huge win in that they stopped it. It was intended to only be a pause, but that pipeline still has not been, it's not been constructed, and hopefully never will.
When I heard you talking about that, I just thought it was so profound, because it shows that when the people come together and the right leadership is in place with, I think that forward thinking of the land and the next 7 generations, and looking at the importance of our youth having access to land and that relationship to continue forward. You had mentioned something really emotional, I think, when you said, you know, this is partly because of the work of my dad.
Yeah.
And when you said that, I just thought how amazing it is that you embody your father's leadership and continue that momentum, because I think it's crucial that we remember that these are not isolated events. You know, that this momentum, this resistance to colonialism has been a generational thing that has been with us since the beginning of contact. We've been in resistance. So I just really love resurging these stories and these victory stories within the larger context of decolonization. Because when we're in the mind's eye of it, we think it's just this isolated event sometimes. And I think fleshing it out to have a more of a realistic perspective and honoring, I think, the Indigenous resistance movement in every genre is so crucial, because we're doing it now. And so I just really loved that moment when you were speaking about that. It was powerful. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm so on the same page with you. I love connecting all the different pieces of the things that every nation has to offer in terms of our resistance stories, and the things that we have been able to maintain and reclaim and protect and keep intact. I've gotten so much inspiration and gained so much strength from so many different Indigenous friends of different nations all over the world. I think it's also kind of important I think we need to have people doing work that's needed on every single front, and within our communities and outside of our communities. It's so important to advocate for space, and for that space to be space that we can hold and make really important change in those places.
I love that. that holding of the space, because it kind of leads me into my next inquiry of this conversation. But how have you been able to find space or create space, hold space, what you're talking about, while bringing that educational past with you that has helped you inform colonialism and the land-based knowledge and the family influences? Has there been this moment where everything has come together in a certain phase or stage where I think about the poem with the fur, the sealskin fur,
Yeah.
and that integration of land and honoring of the sacred beings, the animals that have fed your people for time immemorial, and then using, writing as the medium to translate these teachings. Like, is that something that you're intentionally doing? Is it intuitive? Does it feel new? Does it feel right? I'm curious about your artistic practice in that.
Lindsay, your instincts are so incredible. I just have to say that poem that I wrote, the text of the poem it's about a conversation I had with my Inuk dad, who there's been a rift, a lifelong rift with him since early childhood because of the impacts of residential school, his experience. So I was raised from an early age from my single mom, and she passed away when I was just turned 14. So the poem is about a conversation that I initiated with my dad to ask him about my mom, about why she had this particular nickname in his community in Nunavut. And he, like many men his age that went through the residential school system, has a really difficult time talking about that. And he doesn't really like to communicate by talking a lot. So it's hard to pull things out of him. And this conversation ended up being super profound for me, because the nickname I learned that she was given in his community is also the name for a particular landscape that's very, very special. And that he said that when people were taken away, when they went to school, because from his community they were taken by ship 3,000 kilometers south from Nunavut to Churchill, Manitoba, and he was there for several years, I think 8 years, and his dad died, and at that time, and he lost an older sister in one of the schools, and so much tragedy happened. But he said when kids were taken away, they always they held on to that landscape. When they envisioned home, they envisioned that landscape. And so he kept that landscape alive inside, in secret. And he also maintained his Inuktitut language. He emerged from that time fully fluent when most of the other students lost their Inuktitut. And so I learned the nickname he gave my mom is for that landscape, which meant even though all of this tragedy had happened within my own family, and my parents separated, and my dad wasn't very much in my life anymore, he still must have had this incredible amount of love for my mom to give her that name. And I had been spending a lot of time in Kinkum Inlet and in Coast Salish territories in Victoria when I was writing that poem. And so right beside the ocean, right near mountains, both my parents are from homelands that have ocean and mountains. And this, it's kind of like a genetic memory that came up because I was so young when my mom was alive and when we were in Nunavut. So I had this question kind of surface: why was she called that name? The name's Akia. And I realized that so much of the work that I do is resurgence work. It's working with communities. It's helping repair relationships between generations and between people in the land, and helping support young people to embody their own relationships and their own survival skills. And all the things I do with community work and all the things I write about is all based in resurgence. But I also had to think deeply at that time about what that means for me. What is the actual work of resurgence on a personal level? And for me, I have to try my best to repair what has been severed through colonialism. And so that's through love and patience, and being willing to approach those difficult things. So for me, it was initiating that conversation with my dad. And then this incredibly beautiful thing came out of it. And I felt very strongly like it was important to render that visually, because the Inuk creation story of Sedna is such an important theme for me personally. I felt like something told me to work with sealskin, to write all the letters of the poem that I wrote out of sealskin. And I didn't really think about it until I was about a third of the way in, and I had to stop and realize, holy smokes, I'm working very, very intently with my fingers, working to repair what's been severed between a daughter and a father, when in the creation story, it's the father that cuts off Sedna's fingers. And this whole thing is kind of surfacing emotionally the way that things surface in the water, like in the ocean where we come from. And it's kind of like that creation story, but backwards, and it's in real time. And that's kind of where we are as Indigenous peoples, is having to work from the other end of everything that we've been put through, and everything that has worked to erase us and remove us and alienate us, and turn us into something different than we know that we are meant to be. And so we're having to do that work starting from the outside and trying to work our way back in.
I agree. That's a really amazing story, because I think what it really shows is the parallels that are in motion. You know, having sort of an external experience with the work, recognizing that transformation story you're starting to really embody, and it's starting to show itself in a fruition through this art piece. I do feel and relate to exactly what you're saying. The hardest work is the work at home. You know, and I think sometimes, and even in my own experience with education, you know, I'm learning these theories, I'm learning all of these methodologies, this facilitation, growing in skills, expanding this knowledge, and then I'm still fragmented, you know. Right. And so I think that shows a real accountability to the work, is doing the internal work as well as the external work. And I think when those come together in a creative process, new birthings happen. And that's a really beautiful example of that happening, you know, stepping back like, whoa, something's going on here.
And that's my first time really doing visual art. So I kind of like I was amazed, and I thought, is this what it's like for all Indigenous artists? Like, this is just what happens to you guys.
Yeah, there's a big boom in all of it, you know. Sometimes, usually emotionally, it comes from that emotional body. And that's what I think I love about your writing too, is that you bring back the human being into Indigenous culture, into Indigenous knowledge. It's really powerful. Just to sort of close everything, we spoke about a lot of beautiful things, and I think your storytelling influences from your relations really come through you. because your tone of voice changes when you drop into that space, and it creates for the audience to go to another space of listening. And I think that's the power of your presence. It's the power that how I've known you, you know, directly and indirectly, and just kind of acknowledging your artistry, moving into that group exhibition that you did with Marianne Nicholson, and, you know, bringing that collective of people together. And I was watching from a distance saying, she's becoming, you know, she's becoming, she's using all that influence and that information, and the information from the institution as well. And that's the way that, you know, I think grounding this conversation, because I work for that institution. So it's also trying to highlight, you know, where in someone's educational journey they could really ground, they could really self-determine, and still have the authenticity to create an educational journey that is land-based, that is governed in an Indigenous worldview, and you embody that.
Thank
So
you.
thank you. And I think just one other thing that I'm curious about is, you know, the new work that you're doing right now for the government and starting this inquiry, extending the work that, you know, has been done. The inquiry came out 2019 last summer. And so what is your hope in this new way from a government perspective, now that you're kind of within working for that institution? How are you feeling like you're going to navigate that, and what is your hope to bring to that work?
Thank you. This strategy in the Yukon is guided by an advisory committee of, there's a government minister representative who is Indigenous, and she is a political leader. She's one of the 3 co-chairs. There's a woman chief of one of the Yukon First Nations who's another co-chair, and there's another woman leader of an Indigenous women's organization. And then there's a whole bunch of other representation. I've learned since living in the Yukon for the last 2 years that they're Yukon grassroots leaders and community members and family members of missing, murdered women and girls were really, really influential in what amounted to the national inquiry. And so these women, these elder women, have been doing this work for over 20 years, and they're still doing the work. And so my hope, I feel like the piece that I would most love to bring to this work is to there's a way forward for, I think colonial governments and most societal structures from Western society are limited in terms of what they feel is possible in scope. So many people are kind of like, they're asking the question, how do you do reconciliation? How do you do decolonization? What are the practical ways? What are the actions? How do we do that? And they're very limited in being able to envision what that looks like. And my hope is that this committee of really powerful people, that I can help be a bridge for them to create the necessary space for the Indigenous women in that sphere, and the representatives of communities and traditional knowledge, that they feel empowered to share the direction that needs to come from a cultural understanding and from a traditional values understanding, from a cultural governance, that those things can be put into place to guide the work forward, and that the government people can see that there's a way to do the things that they have agreed to in principle and don't know how to enact. And I think that work, it has the ability to nourish everybody. Like, so many people want to do the right thing, so many people have the right intentions, and I just would love for everybody's strengths and input to harmonize. And I think that can really change the course of things across the entire country. If all levels of government, if all universities and all institutions could be thinking about things that way, not in terms of like just creating positions so that it on paper looks like we're creating Indigenous roles, but really taking a step back and saying, okay, we acknowledge that we've worked every possible way we could to diminish your leadership and your role in leading life in this whole entire territory. So now how about let's take direction from you and then pool all our resources and all our support. Be partners, be actual partners, and be dedicating some of that power and some of those financial resources and just pool it all, shifting the focus, letting Indigenous people lead the focus.
That's inspirational, I think, ending to this type of conversation, because I think what it does is it's suggesting, actually stating, you know, that settlers and colonization has a responsibility to respond. You know, not be in this reactionary type of engagement, but more about this responsive relationship. I love it. I think that I agree when you talk about that leadership. There's nothing more, I think, liberating than working in a partnership where each side or each individual brings their most precious gifts forward. Yeah. I think also what you might be talking about too, and something that I'm trying to really look in terms of my performative practice and collaborative practice, is creating more of an equalized circle, dismantling the hierarchy. I think that maintains this type of rigidity and lack of creativity that exists in that rigidity. So breaking it apart.
Yes.
But it also, you're bringing in the teachings too, right? Like when we think about land-based teachings and some of the values and principles within our cultures, you know, we have respect and tact, we have reciprocity and sustainability. You know, when we think about that relationship to land. So how much are we using in these land-based teachings and applying them into new systems? I think that the correlation could be solidified even more, you know.
And completely. Everything, like in the last 150 years, has worked to displace us from positions of power and value and relationship, and like everybody had roles, and if we revitalize those things, everybody still has important key roles that would empower, like the way that I'm thinking of ending colonial gender violence targeting Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit, trans people, is if we can think about those traditional values, those traditional systems that ensured protection and respect, held those sacred members of our communities right in the heart, in the center. What are all those things outwardly that radiate outwardly within those societies that keep that intact? They keep the earth intact, they keep life sustainable, they just create balance. Not that things were ever easy. People had to work at it all the time and reaffirm those relationships all the time, but that is a valid framework to try and be bringing back into this, because the frameworks that have the most power and authority now are the legacy of all the destructive things in our society. So it makes a lot of sense if people think with a practical frame.
Well, I just want to end. I feel like I don't want to end, but just it's good to reconnect. It's good to see you. It's good to hear from you. I had a really kind of deep reflections as I was kind of looking at the publications and your writing and hearing the way that you and it reminded me of, you know, your gentle heart, and I think that type of energy that you carry can change the world. and embodying Sedna in your everything that you do, I think is grounding you to your place and to your territory. And I just really look up to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this. And I hope that people that view this interview really can drop into that deep listening that you offer people. And I just send you many blessings on your journey in this new role. And I pray that all of those hopeful messages that you have to bring forward come into fruition, and the ripple effect of that is profound.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I honestly feel all the same ways about you, and I'm so uplifted by you and always have been. And it's so good to see you doing what you do and bringing what you bring, because it's so necessary and important and powerful. So thank you.
Hey, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. So without further ado, I'm going to end this recording. Let me just do that now.